This program contains graphic imagery. Viewer discretion is advised.
I'm Robert McNeil. Welcome to the first night of America at a Crossroads.
An unprecedented look at the greatest conflict in the world today and the challenges all Americans must face.
We discovered how vulnerable we were.
Every American and every Jew are targets.
At least 5 bombs were set off.
What are they saying? You're gonna die and I'm gonna be the one to kill you.
They should be aware what it means to be Muslim in this godforsaken country.
It's not possible to have one face of Islam.
What kind of Muslim would do this to another Muslim?
We've lost 18 men.
It is a war you cannot win. You didn't wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to go bring freedom.
I can't even describe how different my life is from my friends back home.
Use the freedom. The point about freedom is to use it.
Confront the new reality that has placed America at a crossroads. Funding for America at a Crossroads was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This is Ground Zero in Manhattan, the site of the most destructive terrorist act in history and the greatest shock to the American psyche since Pearl Harbor. For 5 years, while financiers and politicians squabbled, this scene of mass murder remained an empty hole, used only for stark ceremonies on the anniversaries of 9/11. Now work has finally begun on a Freedom Tower to symbolize New York's resurgence and on memorials to the 2,773 people who died here, including 343 firemen, 6 of them from this company. This work may well be finished before the country resolves many issues unleashed by 9/11, including 2 unfinished wars and major changes in American security policy at home and abroad. Beginning tonight, we look at where we stand nearly 6 years after, as many said, 9/11 changed everything. First, what have we learned about the people who caused all this? America at a Crossroads begins by tracing the origins of 9/11 and its birth within modern Islam. This is the first film of Osama bin Laden. He is urging Muslims to join his fight against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. What turned the young resistance leader into the world's most wanted terrorist? How was he influenced by the man who is today his deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri?
We tried our best to establish this Islamic State and Islamic society. La ilaha illallah! La ilaha illallah!
How did these men turn the Islamic idea of just war into terrorist war on the West? And how was Al-Qaeda able to use the peaceful and noble religion of Islam to justify the death cult they call a jihad? Early in 1998, Osama bin Laden made a series of calls from his satellite phone. American signals intelligence traced the calls all the way from Afghanistan to a quiet suburban street in North London. This was once the home of the man who headed Al-Qaeda's London cell. On February 22, 1998, he forwarded a fax to Al-Quds, an Arab-language newspaper based in West London. Its editor had once interviewed Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. But nothing had prepared him for the fax, threatening death to Americans and Jews.
To fight and kill Americans and their allies, whether military or civilian, is a duty for every Muslim anywhere in the world.
I was horrified. It is a very, very dangerous fatwa. It is horrible, to kill innocent people without any justification. This is not Islamic. It is un-Islamic to do that. But it was very important, so I published it.
Al-Qaeda's declaration of war on the West made little impact on the English-language press. After all, who on earth was Osama bin Laden? 3 months later, disguised as a local tribesman, the ABC News correspondent John Miller was on his way to answer that question. He and his Canadian cameraman were deep into Al-Qaeda territory. But at each roadblock, the guards became more hostile, more suspicious.
Al-Qaeda might have been the world's premier terrorist organization at the time, but they operated like any other bureaucracy because the two drivers forgot the papers. So everywhere we went, we were stopped and questioned.
You'd have these guys who would jump out from behind the bushes, and they'd had grenade launchers, automatic weapons, and they'd run up to the vehicle, fling open the door, which is unfortunately on my side, hold a torch or flashlight to my eyes, stick a gun in my ribs, a gun to the head.
At one point, they opened fire on us with warning shots from both sides. We could certainly see the muzzle flash and hear the rat-tat-tat-tat of 30 rounds going through the magazine. And the first thing I thought of was my mom saying he got killed going to see who? Osama who? At some point, we came to a crossroad, and there, waiting, was Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Ayman al-Zawahiri is the deputy leader of Al-Qaeda and the other main character in our story.
At midnight, on this mountain, they had set up high-intensity lamps being run by gasoline generators, and a big crowd of people. Everybody was armed to the teeth.
It sounded like World War III was kicking off outside. And obviously, Osama had arrived, and all of a sudden he walked in, and there he was right before me.
I sat down with my 16 questions, and I said, how do you call this war? It's not like fighting soldiers on the field of battle. There's innocent non-combatants, women and children. How do you call that war as opposed to terrorism launched by cowards? And he said, this is a very strange question coming from an American like yourself. Was it not your country who brought us Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Were there no innocent non-combatants or women or children in those places? We are simply taking the rules of engagement that you invented and visiting them back upon you.
Barely 3 months later, Osama bin Laden would strike the first blow in his war on America and the West. Car bombs detonated outside the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The explosions killed 1 CIA agent and 11 U.S. diplomats. Over 5,000 Africans were injured. 235 were killed.
Terror can be either bad or good. We terrorize the oppressors of our faith, land, blood, and property.
For most Muslims, bin Laden's justification of terror is a perversion of Islam. The literal meaning of jihad is striving or struggle. So in Islam, jihad can mean the peaceful struggle against sin and temptation. But there is also jihad of the sword. The Prophet Muhammad was not just a spiritual leader like Jesus, but a soldier and a statesman, commanding armies and fighting battles. The jihad Muhammad waged was not so different from the Christian concept of just war. Abdullah Schleifer is a Jewish American who has lived in Egypt and converted to Islam.
Islam was born in a state of warfare. The Prophet, through revelation, tells the community that they can fight in self-defense. But if your enemy sues for peace, make peace, for God prefers peace. And from that, and from other sayings of the Prophet, you could say the first law of nations resembles the Geneva Agreement. You cannot kill women and children. If your enemy sues for peace, accept that and make peace. You should protect mosques and churches and synagogues where people are at prayer. What bin Laden has done is turn all of this upside down.
Born in a state of war, classical Islam contains militant language. Islam means peace, but the word also has the connotation of submission or surrender. Islam divides the world into the house of peace and the house of war, meaning the non-Islamic world. The most fundamentalist Muslims apply such words very literally indeed. Few branches of Islam are more fundamentalist than that of Saudi Arabia. Ever since Muhammad's jihad, parts of the Arabian Peninsula have been regarded as sacred soil for Muslims. And it was in Arabia 250 years ago that a pious preacher called Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab set out to restore Islam to its original purity. Wahhabism, with its strict enforcement of Sharia law, is still dominant in what is now Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Osama bin Laden. In 1930, a poor mason from Yemen joined a camel train. In search of work, he headed north through Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea port of Jeddah. It was a 1,000-mile journey, and he had to walk all the way. His name was Mohammed bin Laden. He reached Jeddah and worked as a porter in the docks, as a bricklayer, then as a handyman in royal palaces. Ambitious and hard-working, he became the favorite contractor of Saudi kings. With the discovery of oil, the royal family became richer, and so too did Mohammed bin Laden. His construction company became the largest in the kingdom, so prestigious it was trusted with the restoration of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the most sacred place in Islam. The bin Ladens also helped build abroad some of the thousands of mosques and religious schools which the Saudis used to spread Wahhabism around the world. Before his death in a plane crash in 1967, Mohammed bin Laden had fathered 54 children by 22 wives. When their father died, each of his 24 sons became a multi-millionaire. Most of the children, seen here on a family holiday to Sweden, were highly westernized. But it's no accident that Osama, the 17th son, born to a temporary wife, is not in this photograph.
Osama was religious. He didn't like to be photographed. He moved to our neighborhood in the early 70s. They were our next-door neighbor. I knew him very well.
Osama was religious. He grew up religious. He started along that line at a very early age of his life.
He would insist on going to the mosque 5 times a day. Most of us would go twice or 3 times.
He would not listen to music. He would not watch television. He would not go to the movies. He would not shake hands with a woman.
He dressed modestly, refusing to wear shorts when he played soccer. Soon his teammates followed suit.
Osama expected us to do that without even telling us, but just leading by example.
In 1976, he enrolled to study economics at Abdulaziz University. Politics had yet to play any role in the life of Osama bin Laden. But university exposed him to the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Osama and I from the same generation. And that generation was influenced by the Islamic awakening. The Muslim Brotherhood is the most important modern Islam movement. It is the movement which put politics back to Islam.
Bin Laden's interest in the Muslim Brotherhood was the first step on the long path that would lead to the formation of Al-Qaeda. Those ideas were born not in Saudi Arabia, but in Egypt. Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, whose ideas influenced Osama bin Laden, was born in Cairo. This teeming cosmopolitan city is the capital of Egypt and the intellectual center of the Arab world. Influenced by Saudi fundamentalism, the Brotherhood began as a protest movement against British colonialism, poverty, and injustice. It evolved into a mass movement which turned traditional Islam into a political ideology known as Islamism.
Islamism, now, of course, a lot of the Islamists like to disown the word because it's being used by their enemies. It's a good word because it's clear you're not talking about Islam, you're talking about something else. But this Islam has been emptied of its spiritual content. In place of spiritual content has come ideology. A revolutionary Western ideology that talks of the Islamic State as Marxists would talk about the Leninist state or the socialist state or the fascist state, you know, whatever.
The Muslim Brotherhood blended Islamic fundamentalism with elements from the political ideologies of the 20th century. The leading intellectual in the Muslim Brotherhood and the man whose ideas would shape Al-Qaeda was Sayyid Qutb.
Was he the Lenin of the Islamic movement? Perhaps so. And I don't think Islamic thought and the thought of the Islamists, the thought of the jihadists, would have gotten us where we are today without the crucial role of Sayyid Qutb.
A writer of brilliantly lucid Arabic, Qutb would influence a whole generation of Islamists. His life and thought are central if one's to understand the men and ideas behind Al-Qaeda. And as we shall see, he also had a great impact on his fellow Egyptian, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is today bin Laden's deputy. An official in Egypt's Ministry of Education, Qutb was also a writer of novels, short stories, and political journalism. The issue of Israel was already poisoning Arab and Muslim attitudes to the United States.
In the late 40s, when Jewish immigration to Palestine was building up, his superiors became increasingly alarmed that he was taking an anti-Western, anti-American view. And they thought the sensible way to cure him of this problem was to send him to study educational methods all over the United States.
He ended up going to Greeley, Colorado, and these 2 years in America, in a way, fed his neurosis about the West And I think they were critical to his evolution. He came to America in 1948 and left America much more anti-Western than ever before.
He disliked the way Americans lived. He took exception to the way Americans devoted an enormous amount of attention to their lawns.
There's no setting for a home quite so effective as a lovely expanse of thick green grass.
Qutb regarded the suburban obsession with hedge trimming, lawn mowing, and outward appearance as selfish individualism. Each week he wrote home to Mahfouz Azam, a pupil and protege.
He was shocked by a sense of materialism in American society. Also, its enjoyment of violence in leisure and sport. Take boxing, for instance. Spectators were drinking and yelling, "Kill him! Kill him!" He thought the advance of intellect depended on the encouragement of human values. Civilization should favor humanity, not act against it.
These feelings came to a head at a dance in a church hall. As the gramophone played, the pastor dimmed the lights.
The dancing intensified. Arms circled arms, lips met lips, and the atmosphere was charged with love and lust.
He went there, he saw young people dancing, cheek to cheek, breast touching breast, as he describes in his memoir. And this is something that really seems to have turned him round completely. This really convinced him that Western society was hopelessly doomed and represented everything in opposition to the pure values of Islam. It was a sort of epiphanic moment for him. It was his moment of self-discovery.
In Qutb's eyes, Americans were not free, but were prisoners of greed and selfishness. And American civilization was not moving forwards, but worshiping at the altar of godless materialism.
New Chevrolet Bel Air.
Qutb returned to Egypt convinced that Western influence was reducing the Arab world to Jahiliyyah, the state of paganism which had existed before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad.
In classical Islamic writing, it's a word that is quite loaded. It's got the meaning of ignorance, but also arrogance. The arrogance of the pagans who won't acknowledge the truth of God, the truth of Muhammad's message. Qutb took this term and gave it a completely new definition. He describes as Jahiliyyah the contemporary social universe of Cairo, of Egypt, and indeed the modern world, which has been corrupted by Western materialism.
Sayyid Qutb ended up saying that a society can be outwardly Islamic, but still could be classified as a pagan society. What he put on the table was this idea that a society can profess to be Islamic, but could really be living in violation of Islam. That was the great contribution of Sayyid Qutb.
So he makes this equation between the paganism of the Arabs of yore with contemporary society.
In Qutb's eyes, the only way to reverse this violation was to create an Islamic republic, governed not by man-made laws, but by the law of God. Qutb and his fellow Islamists would find themselves in conflict with Egypt's new secular rulers.
Ex-King Farouk has gone into exile, while the future of Egypt and her relations with the West are questions still to be resolved.
In 1952, a group of army officers carried out a coup d'etat. Egypt's new strongman was Gamal Abdel Nasser. His vision for Egypt and for the whole of the Arab world was secular, nationalist, and socialist. It was a vision that looked more to Moscow than Mecca. A botched assassination attempt gave Nasser the excuse to round up thousands of Muslim brothers. 6 were executed. Many others received long prison sentences. Among them, Sayyid Qutb. One of Qutb's interrogators was then a young police officer.
I remember that he was ill and fuming with hatred and anger towards society, and he thought he should avenge his unjust punishment.
The man who today leads the Muslim Brotherhood was in prison with Qutb.
He saw his brothers suffer the most severe forms of torture, which even the strongest man cannot tolerate. I myself was in shackles. I would see worms eating my flesh, but could not move.
There were a group of Muslim brothers who were in prison with him, and they wanted to go on a strike. The prison authorities dealt with that by opening their cell door and shooting them down. Qutb was horrified, and he asked himself, what kind of Muslim would do this to another Muslim? He decided that they were not Muslims. In his mind, he excommunicated them.
This experience led him to write Signposts on the Road, short, sharp, and simple. It was a call for Islamist revolution.
Nasser was a military dictator who saw that new ideas were a threat to his rule. The book Signposts on the Road explains how society can organize itself and resist the dictator. It's a call for liberation.
We cannot compromise with Jahiliyyah society. We can show it no loyalty. Islamic Jihad frees mankind from slavery to other men so that he can serve God.
Qutb's life and ideas had enormous influence on the man who is today the deputy leader of Al-Qaeda. Ayman al-Zawahiri was born in Cairo in 1951. Zawahiri grew up in the relatively prosperous suburb of Madi, part of an educated middle-class family. Mahfouz Azam, the man who had been Qutb's lawyer, was also Zawahiri's uncle.
Ayman was quiet and had few friends, but he read a great deal. He was an intellectual. When he was young, he would read religious and political books by Sayyid Qutb and others. He was curious about everything.
Sayyid Qutb was a family friend, and his trial and punishment had a tremendous effect on the teenage Ayman al-Zawahiri. In 1965, the Egyptian authorities had rearrested Qutb.
I've read these transcripts of his trial. Clearly, this was a man who knew he was going to be executed. He understood that the Nasser regime had picked him up again and had brought him to trial to murder him.
Everyone, from Nasser down, expected Qutb to appeal against his death sentence. But Qutb refused.
Qutb replied that his ideas would have more influence when he was dead than alive.
General Fuad Alam witnessed the execution.
He was very low. He kept saying any judgment other than that of God was false. He told his followers, trust only God's judgment.
Qutb's martyrdom was a turning point for Ayman al-Zawahiri. Years later, he described it as the spark that ignited the jihad movement.
This young man joins the Islamic movement at 16. In the aftermath of the execution of Sayyid Qutb, he joins it when people were running away from it. They wanted to get out of harm's way. He wanted to get into harm's way. So there's something, it tells you about the willpower of Ayman Zawahiri.
In his writings, Zawahiri later quoted from a poem by Sayyid Qutb.
Brother, push ahead, for the path is soaked in your blood. Do not turn your head right or left, but look only up to heaven.
In 1967, Israel launched a preemptive attack on the 3 Arab armies that had massed on its borders.
On the 7th day of the 6-day war of 1967, when Abdel Nasser, the man worshipped by modern Arabs as being possibly the greatest Arab since the Prophet Muhammad, was defeated, Arab nationalism was devastated with him. This was the Waterloo of Arab nationalism.
In the wake of this shattering defeat, an Islamist revival began to shake the Muslim world. The Arabic word was sawa, the awakening.
There were many, many preachers who rejoiced in his defeat. The Islamists are emboldened, and they put forth an argument that God had punished these regimes for their godless ways, for their wicked ways. And they put forth the argument that these regimes deserved it. When the Arabs woke up to the debacle of the 6-day war, the Islamists had a very powerful argument to peddle.
When Nasser died, the dream of secular Arab nationalism was buried with him. Zawahiri summed it up like this.
The direct influence of the 1967 defeat was that many people, especially the young, returned to their original identity as members of Islamic civilization.
At about this time, Abdallah Schleifer got to know Zawahiri's family and relatives.
The Nizam family is a very prominent family. The fact that I was a convert to Islam was something they appreciated. So through them, I met Ayman, who was married into the family and who was just finishing up at medical school. And he's the one who took me on tour of the campus to give me a sense of what was going on. And I saw the young people making posters, the women preparing hijabs. They were actively out demonstrating all the time.
The Islamic revival had reached the universities.
I sensed that he was an activist. I assumed that he was an important figure in this upswell of Islamist sentiment at the universities. I had no inkling at all that he belonged to a secret cell that exists in order to set in motion a coup d'etat.
Zawahiri was maintaining a facade. A success at medical school, his appearance was young, modern, and unbearded. But in secret, he'd begun recruiting army officers to join the plot against Nasser's successor. Anwar Sadat had signed the Camp David peace treaty with Israel, and Zawahiri saw him as a traitor to Egypt and to Islam. Zawahiri was also becoming increasingly hostile to the Western powers that supported the Egyptian government.
I went over to his house. He launched this big attack on America about how America was as much their enemy as Russia was. This was new. Maybe he's always believed it, but this was new to me. And the point about the discussion, because we've argued things before, was I was no longer talking with a fellow human being, so to speak. He wasn't relating to me. I'm looking into his eyes, but he was looking beyond me. He was addressing a hypothetical audience of tens of thousands of people. And he wasn't dealing with me, Abdullah. He had become a complete ideologue. And I was amazed by that and felt very sad.
Zawahiri
was a rebel and believed this government was illegitimate.
His idea about revolting against authority and the system started in 1966 when he was 16. He was obsessed with having a military force or trained armed men to revolt against the system.
Aware of the growing threat posed by militant Islamists, the government began to round up the usual suspects. In 1981, a cell within the army, part of the same terrorist organization as Zawahiri's, decided to activate a plan before they too were caught. Every October, Anwar Sadat took the salute at a military parade. The event was so routine and predictable that reporters and cameramen were drifting away when suddenly one of the army trucks stopped in front of the saluting stand. 4 soldiers sprayed the stand with gunfire. As Sadat fell, one of his assassins called out, "I have killed the pharaoh."
Zawahiri and his colleagues read Sayyid Qutb, and they understood his statement to mean that you can excommunicate another Muslim and justify his murder. The first victim of that logic was Anwar Sadat. They justified their murder of Sadat because they decided he was not a Muslim any longer and no longer deserved to live.
Ayman al-Zawahiri was one of the hundreds of Islamists summarily arrested and thrown into prison. In the cell next to him was Montasser al-Zayat.
They used to electrocute us with a stick like a police truncheon. On our gums, lips, our nipples, even our genital organs. They used to make us stand on a chair and then pulled our tied hands backwards onto the edge of the door. Then they would remove the chair and you would be left hanging on the door with your arms supporting you. This causes temporary paralysis in the arms. Some people were even paralyzed for life.
The physical torture was terrible, but the moral humiliation was even more degrading. Zawahiri broke and named names. It was Zawahiri's uncle who defended him at the trial.
The manner of his torture was discussed at the trial. It was almost medieval.
Torture gave Zawahiri an unquenchable thirst for revenge. At his trial, he seemed more extreme, more violent.
We believed in our religion, both as an ideology and practice, and hence we tried our best to establish this Islamic State and Islamic society. La ilaha illallah! La ilaha illallah! We are not sorry about we have offered for our religion, and we have sacrificed, and we are still ready for more sacrifices till the victory of Islam. La ilaha illallah!
I think for Zawahiri, those 3 to 4 years that he was imprisoned and the torture he endured and the fact that he broke down under torture really defines and the Zawahiri's life henceforth. He never forgave the state. And I think he never forgave himself.
The Egyptian state had tried to crush the Muslim Brotherhood, but it could not suppress its ideas. These had reached Saudi Arabia and the young Osama bin Laden. Egypt's continual crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood drove many into exile. This is how, when bin Laden was a university student in Jeddah, several Muslim brothers came to be teaching there. And one of these was Sayyid Qutb's brother, Muhammad Qutb.
Muhammad Qutb, Sayyid Qutb's brother, came to Saudi Arabia after he got out of prison. He was influential, also a writer and a philosopher whose ideas parallel that of his brothers. He lectured in Jeddah, and bin Laden would go to his lectures. He was extremely popular.
Muhammad Qutb is calling for Muslims to be dominant, Muslims to be distinguished, Muslims to resist humiliation. Probably could have been the basis for what bin Laden is thinking now.
It seems that bin Laden was already mentally preparing himself for jihad.
He built a farm and he would go there every weekend and take care of the horses and do some farming and sleep under the sky. He would tell us we have to be prepared because one day we're there to defend our country or to liberate Jerusalem. So we should be tough. We should learn skills. Even at that time, he was preparing himself to his destiny.
The Islamic awakening was spreading through the Muslim world. In 1979, it exploded on the streets of Tehran. Demonstrators swept the pro-Western secular Shah of Iran from power. A million people lined the streets when the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile and installed his Islamic Republic. But the impact of the Iranian Revolution on the wider Muslim world was complicated by the fact that the Iranians were from the Shia, the minority sect within Islam. The event that would galvanize the far more numerous Sunni Muslims was about to take place next door in Afghanistan. It would make bin Laden's dream of jihad come true. On Christmas Eve, 1979, the Red Army invaded Afghanistan. As the Soviets swiftly occupied the country, no one gave the Afghans a chance. Future generations may well see the war that followed as a pivotal date in the 20th century, the last act of the Cold War and the beginning of the next great world conflict. Behind the scenes, the Central Intelligence Agency initiated a huge covert operation.
We and the Saudis provided several billions of dollars worth of equipment in the hope of turning up the heat on the Russians to the point where they would withdraw.
Religion made the fighting fiercer. To the Mujahideen, the Soviets were an army with no God. To conceal its involvement, the CIA channeled arms and money through Pakistani intelligence. The Pakistanis favored the most fundamentalist fighters, who would later morph into the Taliban. Back then, the CIA didn't mind, so long as their arms reached those who were most eager to kill Russians.
There was a conscious decision among all the supporters of the Mujahideen to provide most of the weaponry to the people who would actually go out and kill Russians.
As the war dragged on, refugee camps in Pakistan stretched as far as the eye could see. The suffering of the Afghan people sent shockwaves through the entire Muslim world, the Ummah. The Ummah is the world community of Islam. The oppression of a Muslim at the far end of the world will affect a devout believer as personally and as painfully as an attack on his own neighbor. An attack on any part of the Ummah is an attack on all. A religious scholar called Sheikh Abdullah Azam called on the Ummah to support a war of resistance against the invaders, a just war, a jihad.
Bin Laden introduced himself to my father. My name is Osama bin Laden. I want to get an idea about the Afghans' jihad. He said that I was looking for that since I was a kid. I was dreaming of being a mujahid, of being a holy warrior. So my father sat with him for more than 4 hours. After that meeting, Osama bin Laden came to Afghanistan.
In 1984, bin Laden followed Azam to Peshawar in Pakistan, a dusty city on the border of Afghanistan. At that time, the wealthy young Saudi was working as a fundraiser for the cause. Here, in a former British government guest house, bin Laden helped set up and pay for the Office of Services. The office was a precursor to Al-Qaeda. But to begin with, it served as a clearinghouse for young volunteers who were traveling to Peshawar to support the jihad as aid workers, doctors, or fighters. One of the first people to encounter Osama bin Laden was an Algerian jihadist whose nom de guerre was Abdullah Anas, and who still regards him as a friend.
One of the things which drew my attention was he kept silent for the whole meeting. This lasted 2 or 3 hours. He spoke very little.
The early days of the jihad were still a time of high ideals. In the winter of 1984, Abdullah Anas joined a Mujahideen supply column. He was one of the first 3 Arabs to travel to the front line and wage jihad for what he believed was a noble cause.
We had no idea of the difficulties we would face. It took 40 days in the dead of winter. 2 Afghanis died of the extreme cold. The column included 250 mujahideen, 100 horses, donkeys, weapons, and supplies. The journey was like a rebirth for me. You find yourself living with the Afghani mujahideen who are fighting to free their country. You begin to feel part of them. Your gun is on your shoulder, and you are proud of that.
Bin Laden wanted to fight for jihad too. He was tired of fundraising. In 1986, he established his own independent fighting force near the village of Jaji, 10 miles inside Afghanistan. Abdullah Anas warned bin Laden the new camp would waste money and weaken the resistance movement.
A huge amount of money and resources went to Jaji, while bigger battlefronts went short. These needed more than Jaji. There was the blazing battlefront in Panjshir Valley. There was frontline fighting in Kandahar and in Herat.
But Osama was wealthy enough to have his way because he's financing the whole thing. He's not taking the money from anybody to do it. It is from his own pocket.
Then, in April 1987, the Soviet army launched a major offensive along the border.
Jaji was right at a crossing point between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was a route to smuggle weapons inside Afghanistan. And the Russians wanted to cut that route.
For the first time, Arab fighters faced the Russians as a separate unit.
Bin Laden was not really in command. He had surrendered his command to one of his Egyptian assistants, who was quite a brilliant military commander. But by all accounts, Bin Laden fought very courageously.
Jaji was militarily insignificant, but it made Bin Laden a celebrity.
He became quite well known. His first pictures ever being published were taken by me. And Osama became a well-known figure after that.
Until now, Bin Laden had always turned his back on cameramen and photographers. He refused to be filmed for a whole month, until this cameraman asked if he wanted to address the world. This was how these first images of him came to be shot.
Thank God for giving us the gift of faith and religion, and thank God for giving us the blessings of jihad. It is an obligation.
From now on, Bin Laden used the media to shape his image.
Osama bin Laden calls upon imagery that is deeply meaningful to Muslims. The cave is where Muhammad received the word of God. He sits at a meal with his legs crossed, as the Prophet did. He likes to eat what people leave on their plates. This is the way the Prophet behaved. He is playing notes that resound all over the Muslim world.
We are proud to raise the same banner as the Prophet raised years ago. God gave us jihad to wash away our sins.
The role of the Arab Mujahideen became very popular after that. The number of the Arab Mujahideen multiplied, tripled in just 1 year.
He wanted to create an all-Arab legion, an emergency response corps that would draw from these trained fighters who would be put to use anywhere in the world where Muslims were threatened. Bin Laden already had the idea of what would later become Al-Qaeda.
But Bin Laden's vision was to be changed forever by the arrival from Egypt of Ayman al-Zawahiri. After 3 years in prison, Zawahiri was released. He left Egypt and in 1986 made his way to Peshawar in Pakistan. There he was joined by a group of fellow militants from Egypt. Prison had not softened Zawahiri's belief. He believed Western democracy should not flourish in Islamic society because it substitutes man-made laws for God's law. He even despised mass movements like the Muslim Brotherhood. Dr. Zawahiri believed in radical surgery, a violent coup d'etat carried out by a revolutionary elite. Zawahiri began to work at this hospital in Peshawar. But even as he treated patients, his political beliefs were hardening. Zawahiri was coming to believe that only terrorism could topple the regime in Egypt. The Quran forbids Muslims from shedding the blood of fellow Muslims. But an obscure doctrine known as takfir justifies such bloodshed.
The word takfir has become increasingly current, and it basically means a declaration of infidelity. It means pronouncing that someone with whom you disagree is an infidel.
Most Muslims believe only God can decide who is and who is not a Muslim.
That an activist, that a militant would grant themselves that they can actually decide that even though you profess the faith of Islam, you're not a Muslim. That really is where this civil war in Islam begins.
And this is really entirely counter to the inclusive traditions of most Islamic law.
Classically, Islamic thought was very generous. It just said, your faith is between you and God. Once you say you're a Muslim, then your own self-representation should suffice. This is the Islam of my parents. This was the Islam of my ancestors.
Dr. Zawahiri's ideology crystallized in Peshawar. He declared takfir on anybody who took part in elections or carried an election card. That means millions would become kafir, infidels. This was disastrous. Soldiers, journalists, people working in the tax office, a civil servant that carried out his duties is a kafir, not a Muslim anymore.
At some point in 1986, the younger and politically far less experienced Osama bin Laden met Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Osama bin Laden began to flirt with the radicals, with the extremists, began to spend time to visit with Ayman al-Zawahiri.
When Zawahiri met bin Laden, he saw a lot of potential in him. And bin Laden became one of Zawahiri's close friends, perhaps the man he trusted the most. Zawahiri influenced him on an emotional, intellectual, and psychological level. Zawahiri became bin Laden's brain.
It was Zawahiri and the Egyptians, the Takfiri thinking Egyptians, who captured bin Laden's mind about what they could do in the future. Anybody could be killed. This was a turning point in the history of Al-Qaeda and the Islamist movement. Once the idea of takfir became deeply rooted in that movement, nobody was safe.
In August 1988, bin Laden chaired a series of meetings at one of his houses in Peshawar. The formal notes of that meeting have survived. After praise for Zawahiri and his Egyptian followers, the notes describe the formation of a new organization.
The work of Al-Qaeda commences on the 10th of September 1988. Its goal will be to lift the word of God to make his religion victorious.
Zawahiri had not yet joined Al-Qaeda, but his influence on bin Laden had been profound.
It took the heresy of the Takfir to change him from being simply a pious young Muslim to being a mass murderer.
In the same year as the formation of Al-Qaeda, Russian troops began a phased withdrawal from Afghanistan. 15,000 Soviet troops had died. It had been the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
This was a galvanizing event for the young generation in the Islamic world because it proved that Muslims don't have to lose every war they fight.
Now they planned to take the jihad home with them.
Many of those individuals returned to their home countries and began leading insurgencies, began forming their own terrorist groups. You had them in Algeria, you had them in Egypt, you had them in Saudi Arabia, you had them in a lot of places. This was a big problem.
The new jihadists declared takfir on what they called the ungodly governments of the Middle East. This was the so-called strategy of the near enemy, and one of its chief advocates was Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Zawahiri taught bin Laden about jihad and how the Arab regimes do not follow the Quran, but instead serve the interest of Jews and Christians around the world, and especially the United States. That is why we should rebel against them.
The regimes in the saddle are extremely powerful. They have military power, they have money, they have Western connection and support and patronage. So the rebel facing this unequal power justifies all kinds of violence.
You must not follow such rulers, but instead attack them.
Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia in 1989. Before long, events would turn him against the government of his own country and make him an implacable enemy of the United States.
When the Afghani war ended, Osama bin Laden found himself back to this luxury life. You can have luxury cars, you can have luxury villas, but you can't have freedom. Here is a man who spent a great deal of his life in the mountains as a hero, a job to do. Suddenly he found himself caring about constructions, about accounts, about money. So it was a boring job for him. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he found it as a golden opportunity for him to resume his role as a holy warrior.
In August 1990, Saddam Hussein's tanks rolled across the desert and into Kuwait. Alarmed by the threat to Saudi Arabia and its oil, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney led an American delegation to Jeddah.
What we said was that we would come, that we would bring a large force, large enough to do the job, and that we would stay until it had been completed, but when it was over with, we would leave.
King Fahd told Cheney, "I trust President Bush. Tell him to have his army come quickly. I have his word they will leave when this is over."
Osama bin Laden saw an opportunity. He had been building this private army, Al-Qaeda, and he thought he had an opportunity to use it to defend his own homeland. His idea was that bin Laden's Mujahideen, plus thousands of unemployed young Saudis, would defend Saudi Arabia against a 1 million-man army of highly trained Iraqis, with one of the largest tank corps in the world. And with great enthusiasm, he went to talk to the defense minister and to Prince Turki to try to sell his idea.
His response was, "Thank you very much, but don't call us, we'll call you." It was felt that bin Laden's ability to drive out the Iraqis was basically non-existent.
Thanks to the Saudi regime's subservience to the West, especially America, they prevent the sons of the country defending their own land and instead let American unbelievers do it for them.
That was the break point for Osama with Saudi Arabia, was the decision by the king to invite Americans onto the Arabian Peninsula. All Muslims know that the Prophet said there should be no infidel presence on this peninsula. So it's a very, very powerful motivating factor, not only for Osama bin Laden, but for Muslims.
We don't like to see the Christian and Jewish female soldiers defending us. Our leaders lied when they said they had invited them for only a few months.
The first Gulf War was fought, and the American army drove Saddam Hussein back to Iraq. But the American troops did not leave right away.
Whenever he talked about it, bin Laden would clock the number of years that had gone by. We let the Americans in for a year. They're still here now, and it's 96, it's 97, it's 98.
At odds with the royal family, bin Laden was no longer welcome in his own country. In 1992, he left Jeddah. For the next few years, his refuge would be the capital of Sudan, Khartoum. Sudan had become the first Sunni country where the Islamic awakening had actually achieved government. The architect of Sudan's revolution was a Paris-educated Islamist called Hassan al-Turabi. At the People's Palace beside the Nile, Turabi hosted conferences for the most radical Islamists.
Turabi wanted to make Khartoum a center for all these groupings, and anybody who claimed to have any jihadist or revolutionary attitude was invited to come and pitch tent in the Sudan.
Out in the country, Sudan was allowing extremist groups to build as many as 30 training camps, like the one hidden behind these gates. Then, as now, Turabi would smile and brush awkward questions aside.
Why did they develop these so-called camps? When they meet together, they are mujahids. They don't engage in cultural debates or dialogue or studies. Actually, that was not their course of life. They're together as fighters. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! So they come and train and think of ideas of waging jihad.
On the face of it, bin Laden seemed to have forsaken jihad. His enormous personal wealth made him a significant figure in Sudan's economy. He undertook major construction projects.
He built an airport, and he built a road up to the airport, and he started investing in animal resources and in agriculture.
But bin Laden had not turned his back on jihad. The 3 villas he rented in Khartoum's most upmarket district were heavily guarded. The armed bodyguards came from the separate terrorist group of Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Sudan was a natural staging area for Zawahiri's war on Egypt. The borders are porous and extensive. He was able to smuggle weapons in on ancient trading trails. It was from there that Zawahiri's group began its campaign of terror.
Nearly 400 people have died violently in the last 18 months in bombings and assassinations by Islamic militants.
He began with several assassination attempts in Cairo. And the Sudanese fostered these attempts. They were opposed to the Mubarak regime. They foresaw the day when the Islamic revolution they had created in Sudan would naturally spread to Egypt and to encompass that whole region. They worked hand in hand with Zawahiri.
Takfir stated that it was acceptable to kill fellow Muslims in the name of Islam. Many innocent Muslims would pay with their lives, as first Zawahiri and then Osama bin Laden put Takfir into action.
Bin Laden had begun to not only criticize, but to call for the overthrow of the Saudi government. It was felt that he had gone beyond the pale, so he was stripped of his citizenship.
God have mercy on us, forgive us our sins, and bring us all to everlasting life.
The presence of American soldiers in Saudi Arabia was still the issue.
May we love you in all things.
Then on November 13th, 1995, the first of 2 car bombs exploded outside American military buildings, killing 7.
The bombings in Riyadh and Koba were a clear sign for the armies of the Crusaders to depart before it's too late and before the battle begins in earnest.
The perpetrators were caught. There was definite proof that bin Laden had something to do with that.
Before they were beheaded, Saudi television broadcast the taped confessions of the young men accused of carrying out the bombing.
They confessed to having been inspired by bin Laden, among others.
At the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, bin Laden's image as a wealthy businessman was wearing thin.
After the November 1995 bombing in Riyadh, we began to pay much closer attention to bin Laden. It's simply because his name becomes to come up in intelligence operations everywhere. We set up a bin Laden unit. It went into operation in January of 1996.
It became clear that he was a person that was serving as a patron for a lot of people who were essentially terrorists.
By the end of 1996, we had identified 25 or 30 countries where we knew someone associated with Al-Qaeda was based. The number of countries that we had reporting that mentioned Al-Qaeda was probably double that.
The perception was that bin Laden somehow was linked into all of these people and was providing financial support to many of them.
We put pressure on the Sudanese to turn him over or throw him out of the country.
As a result of all these pressures, the Sudanese government ordered me to cease all my activities.
So bin Laden was forced to leave Sudan. The strategy of the near enemy had failed. No Middle Eastern government had been toppled. Bin Laden's plane took him back to Afghanistan, landing near the city of Jalalabad. In 1996, Afghanistan was in a state of civil war. The Soviet retreat had not brought peace, but years of anarchy in which rival warlords struggled for power. Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, was under siege and had been reduced to rubble. Now a new faction, the Taliban, in their black and white turbans, had joined the fight. Educated and funded by the Saudi government, the Taliban were imposing the Wahhabi version of Islam on the country. Under the Taliban, law and order meant a literal and unyielding interpretation of Islam's Sharia law. Osama bin Laden felt at home here.
I call on Muslims to support this nation because, God willing, this nation will raise the banner of Islam.
An al-Qaeda cameraman filmed the Taliban tanks that protected bin Laden's hideaway. Bin Laden spent the summer here working on a 60-page fatwa. It marked a major change of strategy. It argued that al-Qaeda should stop attacking governments in the Middle East, the so-called near enemy. The new target was the power that supported them, the far enemy, the United States of America.
Our biggest enemy is the American Zionist alliance. They are the head of a spear pointed at the Ummah, our nation. Do not waste any effort on any other enemy.
That autumn, Gwyn Roberts, an independent television producer, entered Afghanistan seeking an interview with Saudi Arabia's most famous dissident.
I flew into Afghanistan and we landed at Jalalabad. And the first impression I had was of this Taliban soldier wearing a black tunic, sitting there on his haunches like some bird of prey.
Roberts' camera captured the anarchy that was Afghanistan. Town after town was falling to the Taliban fighters.
There were Taliban checkpoints up and down the main roads, and you'd see videotape strung up along posts along the road just to emphasize they did not want any images taken. What you would see is TV stations closed down, radio stations closed down. And for women, it was terrible. I mean, women were reduced to begging on the streets. If their husband died, there was no other way to earn money except through that and prostitution.
Roberts checked into a hotel in Jalalabad and waited days for news from his al-Qaeda contact.
And I waited, and one night, at about 9 o'clock, he suddenly turned up. And he said, "This is it." And outside it was pitch black. I was getting slightly nervous at this point and said, "Well, is it all right?" And he said, "Well, as long as you don't have anything on you to alert the Americans to where you are, it'll be okay." And I said, "Well, what if I do have something?" And he said, "Well, I'm afraid you won't return from this alive." And suddenly there was a blare of lights, and a Toyota Land Cruiser came roaring up to me. And we drove off at a furious pace. And we went through numerous Taliban checkpoints. And then they led me into this camp, and there was bin Laden. I found him unexpectedly uncharismatic. He's quite gentle. Got long, delicate fingers. It didn't strike me as a fanatic. His voice was quiet. We spent about 3 hours together. He invited me to supper. It was cold chips and chicken. And we just talked. In the middle of it, they came in and took photographs of me and him.
Unlike the Taliban, bin Laden welcomed and used television to disclose al-Qaeda's emerging strategy.
I think there was a fairly well-developed plan of world war.
There will be war, God willing, between Islam and the Americans and their allies.
His lieutenant said within 10 years there will be a world war which will stretch from China to Afghanistan, to the Middle East, to North Africa, and then into the West itself. And I think it's a prophecy which really has come true.
In November 1996, it was the turn of the journalist Abdul Bari Atwan to trek through the Afghan mountains to interview bin Laden. He soon learned that al-Qaeda had clear war aims and a 25-year strategy.
The first step is to kick out all foreign troops from the Arabian Peninsula and the Muslim worlds. Second, they want to get rid of these corrupt non-Islamic governments, the puppets of the West, as they call them, and then apply the Sharia law, and then start to expand step by step until 2020, hoping to revive the Ottoman Empire under the leadership of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden.
Bin Laden's fatwa accused the Crusader Zionist alliance, meaning Americans and Jews, of a conspiracy against the Muslim world. He saw their hand everywhere, in Iraq, through the UN sanctions and the no-fly zone, in Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir, and above all, Palestine and Israel. In response, he calls upon Muslims to unite in a global jihad. In 1997, Ayman al-Zawahiri rejoined bin Laden. Having failed to overthrow the Egyptian government by terror, he was to merge with al-Qaeda and fall in with its new strategy.
There is a popular belief in the West that Zawahiri is the gray eminence, that he really is calling the shots in al-Qaeda, and bin Laden is just the mouthpiece. But for him to move away from the Egyptian regime being his main target to agreeing with Osama bin Laden, saying, yes, it is the Americans we got to attack first, the far enemy, that is, I think, a very big intellectual shift for Ayman al-Zawahiri. The pecking order is Zawahiri, the lieutenant, to bin Laden, the general.
But Zawahiri had lost none of his political skills. He believed bin Laden needed to sharpen the message of his 1996 fatwa.
Zawahiri convinced bin Laden to publish a statement saying every American and every Jew are targets of our campaign.
Bin Laden and Zawahiri held press conferences about the fatwa and their threat to kill Jews and Americans.
Al-Qaeda thought America would behave like a cowboy if it is confronted in a specific manner.
The suicide bomb attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania had the effect al-Qaeda hoped for.
Bin Laden's interest was not in killing few Americans in the embassies. He intended to have a response from Clinton, this cowboy response.
13 days later, the world heard President Clinton's response.
Good afternoon. Today I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan because of the imminent threat they presented to our national security. Our mission was clear: to strike at the network of radical groups affiliated with and funded by Osama bin Laden, perhaps the preeminent organizer and financier of international terrorism in the world today.
Militarily, the missile attacks were a failure. The chemical plant that was hit in the Sudan turned out to be manufacturing ibuprofen and veterinary medicines, not poison gas. The Afghanistan attack killed 21 al-Qaeda recruits. But bin Laden and Zawahiri were 300 miles away.
It was like a script he has written for the Americans, and the Americans just went along. He wanted to provoke the American into such actions against Muslim countries.
I remember very well, after 1998 bombing in Kenya, Tanzania, there was a huge controversy among many Muslims whether it is right, whether it is justified to kill 200 civilians in those embassies. When Clinton stood up in the platform and declared that bin Laden is his enemy, that controversy was over. I have been told by people in the Saudi intelligence that not less than 11,000 people joined bin Laden in the period between 1998 and September 11 bombings. It's all because of the successful PR service from the Americans.
At his son's wedding, bin Laden recites a poem about jihad. This occasion was to provide another glimpse into al-Qaeda's grand strategy. Bin Laden's son Mohammed was marrying the daughter of Abu Hafs, al-Qaeda's main military strategist. At the wedding, Abu Hafs talked to an Arab journalist about how al-Qaeda would drag America into a war on Muslim soil, and in which countries that might happen.
He was explaining to me what is going to happen in the coming 5 years. And he said, look, there are 2 or 3 places in the world which is the most suitable places to fight Americans: Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia. We are expecting the United States to invade Afghanistan, and we are preparing for that. We want them to come to Afghanistan.
Did they want us involved in the war on the ground in Islamic countries? Absolutely. Part of the goal was to make sure that Muslims perceived America as the infidel invader of Muslim lands.
Bin Laden had instructed al-Qaeda's media committee to prepare its most sophisticated video. It included footage of al-Qaeda training camps, and it was widely disseminated among militant Islamists in the Middle East and beyond.
He said, the fire does not touch feet covered in dust in the cause of Allah.
Among the militants attracted to Afghanistan by bin Laden's growing notoriety were 4 young men who had traveled from Hamburg, Germany. They spoke English and were familiar with life in the West. Only the leader of the group, an Egyptian called Mohammed Atta, was told of the full scope of the mission they were about to join. The others were told only that it would be a martyrdom mission aimed at the United States, and that their first task would be to enroll in flying schools. By the summer of 2001, al-Qaeda was openly hinting that a spectacular attack was on the way.
We were offered an interview with bin Laden. Our management agreed on this interview, and I was asked to do this interview.
When he got there, bin Laden and Zawahiri gave him a photo opportunity and some news.
We are going to give you news. There will be a big surprise. In the next few weeks, we are going to strike an American installation. They were just informing everyone that there will be something big.
America is still traumatized by the shock and horror of what happened on September 11, 2001. In much of the Muslim world, a thick smoke of rumor and conspiracy obscured the truth of what had happened. Filmed less than a month after the attack on the Twin Towers, this grainy amateur videotape appears to show bin Laden boasting openly about 9/11.
The brothers who conducted the attack only knew it was a martyrdom operation. We did not reveal the plan to them until just before they boarded the planes.
Bin Laden even illustrates the plane's impact on the Twin Towers with his hands. But many Muslims prefer to believe that the tape had been faked by Americans.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
On October 7th, U.S. armed forces began operations against Afghanistan. Bin Laden had long planned and hoped for an American invasion.
Bin Laden from 97 was very frank in saying, we want the Americans on the ground in Afghanistan and we will teach them what we taught the Russians.
There is a big difference between American and Russian soldiers. The American soldier is psychologically empty. He's a paper tiger.
But the war in Afghanistan did not go as bin Laden had expected. American special forces were supported by thousands of mujahideen on the ground and B-52s in the air. Most Afghans did not rally to defend the Taliban or al-Qaeda. They had long viewed the so-called Afghan Arabs with suspicion. As the noose tightened on al-Qaeda, its leadership fled eastwards. Bin Laden himself arrived in the mountains of Tora Bora on November 14th, 2001. Zawahiri was with him when Americans started heavy bombardment at the beginning of December.
Our team was about 1.5 kilometers away from bin Laden. I had a four-man team up on a mountain, lighting up his men with lasers and attacking them with airstrikes. We were very close to killing him at that point. The first 3 days of December, we threw a lot of hardware at bin Laden. Radio off of a dead al-Qaeda fighter. We were listening to bin Laden speak to his men. We listened to him pray with them. We listened to him apologize to his men for leading them into what turned out to be a trap where many of them were dying.
The Pentagon had deployed only 40 Americans from Delta Force and a handful of special forces from Britain.
They didn't understand that we needed U.S. forces instead of Afghan forces. I thought only with U.S. forces that we had full faith in could we get the job done.
The American generals had become bureaucrats and didn't want to risk any of their soldiers at Tora Bora.
On the 7th of December, I received a phone call from points most forward in the battle from my deputy and stated that the fighting had come to a halt. And I said, what do you mean the fighting has come to a halt? He said, well, al-Qaeda has sent out 2 people to negotiate, and they're speaking with one of the Afghan warlords who's on our side. And I said, tell them, screw you. We're going to kill you all. That is our negotiating position.
Okay.
Bin Laden was able to execute his escape by throwing a lot of men toward us, telling them to fight to the death. They would delay our advance by doing that. And a lot of them did fight to the death. He would use that as an opportunity to escape south into Pakistan. And of course, the Pakistanis didn't close off every possible avenue.
The most wanted men in the world had escaped into the wild and lawless tribal areas of Pakistan's northwest frontier province. They were lucky to be alive.
He was injured in his left shoulder, and the first videotape he issued after Tora Bora bombing, and he was using his right hand, which is very strange. I know he is a left-handed man. The bombing of Afghanistan was a devastating blow to Al-Qaeda. It deprived them from this safe haven and also from the protection of the Taliban government. So 85% of Al-Qaeda infrastructure and Al-Qaeda organization was destroyed. I thought it was the end of Al-Qaeda.
In the cities, too, Al-Qaeda was under relentless pressure from Western intelligence. In September 2002, Pakistani police surrounded an apartment block in Karachi. Shots rang out. After a 2-hour gun battle, police dragged a man out. He was Ramzi bin al-Shid, head of the Hamburg cell. Six months later, Pakistani security forces found Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11.
They took him away and he was sick, and they didn't even let him wear his slippers or anything.
After undergoing techniques that reportedly included waterboarding, he made an extensive and detailed confession to his American interrogators. In 2002, American military might seemed to have broken the back of Al-Qaeda as an active fighting force. But the invasion of Iraq changed everything.
Make no mistake, when the president says go, look out, it's hammer time.
After the invasion and occupation of Iraq in March 2003, it was the revival of Al-Qaeda. It is the new Al-Qaeda. It is the lifeline of Al-Qaeda. And what a lifeline.
The unexpected gift of the invasion of Iraq has really been more than bin Laden ever dreamed was possible.
Extending the war on terror to Iraq was not like toppling the Taliban. Iraq has profound religious and historical significance. For hundreds of years, Baghdad was capital of the Islamic Empire, the heart and soul of Islam, and the Arab world. For many, the Allied invasion was an act of sacrilege. Despite his success in toppling the Taliban, President Bush continued to warn that a rogue state might give weapons of mass destruction, even nuclear weapons, to Al-Qaeda.
Evidence from intelligence sources, secret communications, and statements by people now in custody reveal that Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda.
We had very solid reporting that bin Laden had established a unit to try to acquire weapons of mass destruction. If they have a nuclear weapon, they will use it. They don't intend it as a deterrent, they intend it as a first strike weapon. Osama bin Laden says, I'm going to incrementally increase the pain on the Americans until I get their attention.
The United States will ask the UN Security Council to convene on February the 5th to consider the facts of Iraq's ongoing defiance of the world. Secretary of State Powell will present intelligence about Iraq's links to terrorist groups.
What I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. And it's no secret
Powell's intelligence about an obscure Jordanian terrorist later proved to be false.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda lieutenants.
In fact, Zarqawi was not a member of Al-Qaeda, and as the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has since confirmed, he had no connection with Saddam Hussein.
Even when he was in Afghanistan, Musab al-Zarqawi always wanted to be independent from Osama bin Laden.
Bin Laden called him to join Al-Qaeda. He refuses to join Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden called him more than 7 times. He refuses.
He did not join Al-Qaeda. He had his own camps in Herat and his own followers, and he kept distance from Al-Qaeda. And he never actually gave the oath of allegiance to Osama bin Laden when he was in Afghanistan.
After 9/11 and the American-led war on the Taliban, Zarqawi and his small band of followers sought shelter in northern Iraq. When America invaded Iraq, Zarqawi started his own personal war without any reference to bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda played no part in Zarqawi's bloody career until the level of indiscriminate killing caused even Al-Qaeda to feel qualms. A letter intercepted by Western intelligence warned Zarqawi that he might lose the jihadists their popular support in Iraq.
The letter has been sent from Dawahiri to Zarqawi, advising him to stop killing civilians. Zarqawi was very angry, and he's telling Dawahiri, don't give me instruction and don't give me orders. You are far away from the battleground and you don't know what's going on here.
Despite their disagreements, Zarqawi needed Al-Qaeda's stamp of approval.
They clearly negotiated over a period of time. Zarqawi didn't have the international authority of the brand. It's like a pirate flag. When you run that flag up the pole, everybody knows who you are. And he wanted that stamp on his effort.
Though we don't know how the deal was done, it suited both parties. From their mountain hideaway, it enabled bin Laden and Zawahiri to maintain the pretense that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was part of their command structure and that they were calling the shots. And Zarqawi was allowed to call himself head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But his days were numbered. The U.S. Army announced that its special forces had finally tracked him down. In June 2006, a bomb put an end to his murderous career.
Zarqawi is dead. We can expect the terrorists and insurgents to carry on without him. But the difficult and necessary mission in Iraq continues.
The American actions were, I believe, exactly what Osama hoped for. It was a full war against the 2 Muslim countries. It became a recruitment tool for Al-Qaeda and for the theology of Al-Qaeda. If that's what Osama wanted, then that's what Osama got.
According to a national intelligence estimate, which pooled information from 16 U.S. government agencies, the Iraq War is causing radical Islam to spread and terrorist cells to multiply. Long wars like those in Iraq and Afghanistan fit into bin Laden's overall strategy.
He told me that it is extremely difficult for him to fight the West inside the heartlands of Europe and the United States. So they are planning to drag the United States to a war of attrition.
In recent releases, Al-Qaeda has been urging its followers to weaken the American economy by attacking oil installations in the Gulf and Iraq.
Bin Laden's begun to call this the bleed to bankruptcy struggle. And he very clearly sees that he cannot defeat the United States militarily, that he must indeed attack in a way that causes us to expend resources at a rate we cannot sustain. He said, all I, Osama bin Laden, need to do is to send 2 men with an al-Qaeda banner anywhere on earth, and the Americans will follow it, send forces, and spend money.
Al-Qaeda strategists have read Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers.
Paul Kennedy said that clearly the first hurdle to the collapse of the empire is to expand beyond its limit. So they expect the United States to be indulged in more wars in the Middle East.
Roger, we copycat vehicles approaching from the east.
So it will suffer huge losses, human losses and financial losses. It will be bankrupt.
We have spent extraordinary amounts of money against Osama bin Laden and have compounded the bleeding through the Iraq War. From his perspective, the bleed to bankruptcy war is perking along just fine.
We don't know where bin Laden is today. 3 armies are searching for him in the mountainous tribal areas along the Pakistan-Afghan border. This is wild country where almost every building is a small fortress, where the people are fundamentalist, and where there are local Taliban. After 9/11, a $25 million reward for bin Laden, dead or alive. But there's been a price on his head before.
America worships money and thinks all people are like her. I swear to Allah, if I thought the reward would work, I would have to change my bodyguards. But I have never changed one.
For the first time in its history, the Pakistan Army has deployed 80,000 troops here. After many armed clashes, it's been forced to make a partial withdrawal. But Pakistan's military command claims that bin Laden no longer leads a functioning terrorist organization.
And extensive interaction in the hearts and minds of the local populace.
The Al-Qaeda command, wherever it is, they are unable to communicate through the internet or through the radio or through the telephone because they are being monitored. It takes about 2 months for Al-Qaeda commander to get his message across and then get the response, because it is all done through the human couriers.
We do a lot of whistling past the graveyard, that Al-Qaeda its back is broken, it can't communicate with its forces, it's isolated. I believe it does exist as an organization.
Al-Qaeda's own videos seem to show it is still a functioning organization. But Al-Qaeda has also become Al-Qaedism, an inspiration to self-starting terrorist groups around the world. John Miller, the TV reporter who interviewed bin Laden in 1998, now works at the FBI.
When you're dealing with a terrorist organization or a mafia family or anything that functions from a headquarters, you watch the hub, you look at the communications, you follow the leadership. Well, there is no hub to watch there because the hub could be anywhere. While we destroyed Al-Qaeda as a structural organization, we have turned it into a franchise where all you need to join is an idea and a laptop.
The internet and 5,000 jihadist websites have spread al-Qaeda's ideas to terrorists as far apart as Bali, Madrid, Casablanca, Istanbul, and London.
The only way to secure our nation is to change the course of the Middle East. And so America has committed its influence in the world to advancing freedom and liberty and democracy as the great alternatives to repression and radicalism.
But whatever you do, don't attempt to spread your misery and misguidance to our lands. Muslims don't need democracy to rid themselves of their homegrown despots and tyrants. What they do need is their Islamic faith, the spirit of jihad, and the lifting of foreign troops and interference from their necks.
Many Muslims see events in Lebanon, Gaza, and Iraq as oppression, justifying more terrorism. There is no shortage of martyrs preparing suicide missions.
We have to warn people. They should never follow their paths, bin Ladens and Zawahiris. And no matter how much they were oppressed, we must adhere to the teachings of the Quran without these misinterpretations. I certainly don't support their violent means, but I do understand why they misinterpret the Quran. It is because of the violence done to them and the nation of Islam, the Ummah. It affects me.
Your democratically elected governments continuously perpetuate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible. Until we feel security, you will be our targets. Our words are dead until we give them life with our blood.
One of the reasons America hasn't been attacked since 9/11 was bin Laden received a great deal of criticism amongst his peers that he had not warned the Americans enough before 9/11. He has addressed 6 separate messages to the American people, warning them specifically, if you don't change your policy, you're going to get attacked again. So you can check that box. He's done that. He's offered President Bush, as the leader of the American people, on 3 different occasions, a chance to convert to Islam, saying, I will be your guide. Now, both of those things in the Western context sound comical, but both of them are fulfilling requirements that the Prophet laid down for making war. Warn them, offer them a chance to convert. On the 3rd issue, he found a very prominent sheikh in Saudi Arabia who wrote a treatise on the use of weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons. And it authorizes the Mujahideen to kill up to 10 million Americans using nuclear weapons. Now has tied up any number of loose ends. And I think they're ready to attack us in the United States.
Osama bin Laden thinks he's set in motion a war with the West that will end only when the entire Muslim world is free of all Western influence. He once called on Muslims to join his jihad in Afghanistan. Now he wants them to take his extreme version of jihad to the whole world.
I hope God can help me and you to bring the faithful to adopt jihad. This is what God wants us to do, to make this religion triumph.
The attacks of September the 11th brought the United States almost universal sympathy and support, except for some public rejoicing in the Arab street. But for Arab governments like Egypt's, Osama bin Laden had become a pariah, his fundamentalist vision a threat to their security. So the U.S. attack on Afghanistan to remove the Taliban and bin Laden was understood. But the war in Iraq and collateral U.S. actions have dissipated much of the goodwill evoked by 9/11, while Al-Qaeda has gained adherents far from the Islamic world. We turn next to the nightmare Iraq has become when America at a Crossroads continues tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night, they work thousands of miles away under the most severe conditions. In a country devastated by violence.
This is the war right here.
We'll explore the world of soldiers in Iraq. And then,
I may not be a very good soldier, but I may be a very good witness.
Their words.
What my crew saw was a very personal experience.
We'll hear their stories.
What do you say to someone who hasn't been there?
Coming tomorrow on America at a Crossroads. Find interactive maps, discussion guides, and more about America at a Crossroads at pbs.org. Funding for America at a Crossroads was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. To order this episode of America at a Crossroads or other programs from the series on DVD, call 1-800-PLAY-PBS.